Hello, good evening and welcome to the 2024 annual Arthur B. and David B. Jacobson lecture. This is the next in a series of annual lectures in which leaders in the field are invited to give a talk dealing in one way or another with issues of anti-Semitism. And as you can see, today's lecture is being recorded and will be on the university's channel. This year, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Wendy Lower. Professor Lower is the John K. Roth Professor of History at Claremont College and directs the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at the Claremont Colleges in California. A highly distinguished scholar, she chairs the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and has published several books on the Holocaust in Ukraine, including Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, published in 2005, and as co-editor with Ray Brandon, Shoah in Ukraine, History, Testimony, Memorialization in 2008. Her path-breaking work on gender and the Holocaust, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, which came out in 2013, was a finalist for the National Book Award and has been translated into 23 languages, including Hebrew. Professor Lower's latest book, The Ravine, A Family of Photographs, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed, which came out in 2021, about which she'll be speaking this evening, won the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category and was shortlisted for the Wingate Prize and longlisted for the Penn Literary Award. Her current research, entitled Disintegration of Power, deals with the last weeks of Heinrich Himmler's life, and from our discussions today, looks to be a fascinating study that will not only shed new light on Himmler's character by examining his desperate efforts to retain some kind of agency in the last days of World War II, but will also investigate the sorely under-researched topic of how genocides end. Her lecture today, however, will take us back to 1941 Ukraine, to a moment of murder captured on a photograph, and what that can teach us both about the Holocaust and about our own time too. Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Teller. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight on this chilly evening. I just got in from Los Angeles last night, so I'm a little bit of in a little kind of weather shock mode, but maybe that's going to energize me, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about my book project and this particular photograph, and it is an atrocity photograph. It's a photograph that depicts a murder scene of a family, and I will talk more today about why this photograph is important and what we can glean from it and what we can do as far as the historical reconstruction of the Holocaust and the themes that are in this photograph that we can pull out and how it shines a light on different facets of the Holocaust and why this is important for Ukraine, and why I've been doing so much work on Ukraine. Now, a lot of this project came out of what was happening, what I was witnessing and observing in museums. I came out of the museum world and also in the classroom. And I started to recognize that, myself included, was putting up images up on PowerPoints when I was lecturing in the classroom. I did a lot of work on Nazi perpetrators, on like the Einsatzgruppen, that maybe doesn't mean anything to you, but these were these mobile killing units in the Eastern European territories, the so-called bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder calls them in his book. And that I had pictures up of some of these horrific crimes and these corpses, basically, the things that you see at the Holocaust Museum. If you come up the 5th floor and the elevator opens, the first you see is a lot of bodies, right? There's a book, actually, that came out the same year as mine that was also a runner for prizes, and it was something like, the title was something roughly like People Like Dead Jews. Like, how is it that we are comfortable with these images of Jewish corpses when it comes to the Holocaust, right? And are we using them responsibly? Are we actually taking the time to investigate who's in the photograph and what happened there, instead of just putting them in a book as an illustration of the horror, right? When you're talking about communities where there's very small percentage who survived, 2%, 1%, 3% in Ukraine, and you come across a source like a photograph or a diary, it takes on that much more value and that much more importance, right? So you can't just kind of use it in a cavalier way, right? So there's an entire debate on the use of atrocity photography that Susan Sontag got into, and there's another scholar who argued you shouldn't look at these photographs. It's like another assault on the victims. Every time you publish them, it's like you're subjecting them to this gaze, this perpetrator gaze, because most of these pictures are taken by perpetrators, right? Who's taking them up close? Who's taking them in a moment of triumph, right? What's the context of this photograph? So all these questions come out with these photographs. Should we use them? How do we use them? What are the ethics of using them? And ultimately, I decided, and here are some of the iconic ones that maybe you're familiar with, that they're too valuable to not use them. And they're out there. They're in the world. We can't suppress them, but we can learn from them, and we can talk about them responsibly and be very committed to, when we use them, make sure that we have those captions, that we've done all of the research. Many of them are miscaptioned too, by the way. So the photos that are out there that have become kind of iconic, as we dig into them, we find out that even those captions are not necessarily accurate. I mean, this one of the entrance to the Birkenau camp, this kind of receding railway line going into the camp, which is architecturally unique. It's the basis of, when you go into the Holocaust Museum, the stairwell goes up, and it's completely based on that perspective. This one's called The Last Jew in Vinica. That was found on a soldier's pocket from Ukraine. Turns out this gentleman is not in Vinica. He's in Berdichev, which is another town near Vinica. But that's significant. This is from the so-called Stroop album, Jürgen Stroop, who was charged with destroying the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, the little boy with his arms raised. Many survivors have come forward and said, I know that person, or I am that person, right? So these images, they generate a lot of conversation, a lot of interaction. How is this picture cropped? This picture crops out Blosha here. There's a gentleman who's standing here who's one of the SS men who's in charge of the destruction of the ghetto, who was tried after the war. And so we actually could identify him, and he was convicted. Here's a famous picture from the liberation of Buchenwald, right? Life magazine, Margaret Bourke-White, the age of, we have these photojournalists who are running around Europe snapping these photos. And Elie Wiesel is famously pictured in the bunk here. And then these corpses, right? The Bergen-Belsen images that are often used for the kind of liberation photography of the Holocaust. It's a whole other kind of genre of 1945. This one of this Einsatzgruppen commander, the Holocaust bullets by, as I mentioned to you, the mass shootings in the killing fields. Again, this is also cropped. We have, more of the unit here. Sometimes it's cropped like this to make it more of a kind of a pairing of the perpetrator and the victim. She's holding the baby. There's more family members running over here. This is in southern Ukraine, and of course, Anne Frank. So just kind of think about when you imagine the Holocaust, or if I ask my students, tell me what you know about the Holocaust, they're often recalling these images. And so it's not only that the images are out there and they're in our public imagination, they're not necessarily used kind of appropriately. This one has, by anti-Zionist organizations, put this on coffee cups and T-shirts, so sometimes they're commercialized in a very crass way that we should be aware of. But also they become stand-ins. Like, people think if they can remember that photograph and describe it to me, that they know the history of the Holocaust, right? Well, in 2009, as these kinds of ideas were swimming around my mind, and I was thinking, gosh, I was already working on another book project, but then this project came to me. And I was in the museum's archives on the 5th floor in DC, working on a perpetrator in Ukraine who was still alive, actually. He was the third person down from Himmler. His name was Bernhard Frank. And so we were mounting a case against him. And 2 journalists from Prague came up to me and said, with one of the scholars at the museum, and said, I think you should take a look at this photograph. It hasn't seen the light of day. It's been in this military archive in Prague. They had discovered it since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they were trying to piece together the story behind it. They knew that it was from Ukraine, October 13th, 1941, that it was taken in a shtetl about 100 miles west of Kiev, Miropol. Miropol, I'm going to show it to you on a map in a minute. Not Mariupol, that's another locality that's been in the news recently. October 13th, 1941, Miropol, Ukraine. The name of the photographer, Lubomir Shkrovina, and they had testimony from the photographer. I mean, that was tremendous to have all those pieces, to know the photographer, know the location, and know the date. So I had something to work with. Not only that, this picture was the one that was kind of featured in the file, if you will, that was the most composed, kind of following a kind of rule of thirds. Remember, photography is also kind of an art form, and when these pictures are created in the darkroom, they're created in a kind of style, a certain aesthetic. This has a kind of aesthetic to it. It's also a piece of evidence, right? So you have to think about these photographs as aesthetic productions as well as kind of in the fact that it's atrocity photo. A photo of a crime, of a murder, is clearly evidence. Now, when my book came out in 2021, in which the entire study is researching this photograph, researching the people and all the elements, and I'm going to tell you that story in a moment, but the timing was nothing that I had really predicted or could have imagined. I'm on the road, I'm doing my thing, I'm talking to people, I'm Zooming a lot because it's still kind of COVID situation. Vaccines just coming out. And then within a year, February 2022, Putin attacks Ukraine. Putin invades Ukraine, right? And Putin in his attack on Ukraine is weaponizing anti-Semitism, right? And even this concept called Holocaust inversion, where he's turning a lot of things on their head. And he's saying that the reason for his special military operation, if you say war in Russia, as you know, you get in trouble. But we can say war here, so I'll say war because we're safe here. And so he says that all Ukrainians, his justification for the war is that, first of all, Ukraine doesn't exist as a country, right? And secondly, it's still Nazified. And it's still filled with all these fascist bandits. And it needs to be denazified. And I'm going to go in there like the old Russian liberator and denazify it like Stalin did in 1943-44, right? And I didn't want to show this picture because one of the things that's very striking about this image is the depiction of collaboration, of Germans here in uniform with their caps and epaulets and all of these markings. These are Ukrainian collaborators. They're wearing Russian coats, they have their armbands, and they're shoulder to shoulder with these Germans. And this is an intimate picture of collaboration. As it turns out, these Ukrainians are from this town. They know some of these victims, by name. So it's not only that these killers are working together, these killers who they're not ethnic German. They don't speak German, these guys. They're speaking on kind of their own language of this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic hate, that they're participating in that together. They're finding common cause. And this is the kind of argument that Putin was trying to make in his justification for the war in Ukraine. So you can imagine if I were out on the road with such an image, how it would play into this propaganda campaign. And so I had to be very careful when I was presenting for a while. And I didn't present for a while. Actually, I was responding to what was going on in Ukraine to some of my colleagues. But then I came up for air, and I started to realize this is actually a moment to educate, to really be specific about what he's saying and what happened in 1941. And 1941 is not 2022, and that he may want to turn the clock back, but actually Ukraine as a nation has changed significantly since the 1940s, and especially obviously in the 1990s of new generations, post-Soviet generations, new education system, a Jewish president, right, Zelensky. And so, these were some of the canards, some of the assertions of Putin in 2022 to denazify, that all Ukrainians are Banderites or bandits, a reference to a Ukrainian nationalist, Stepan Bandera, that Zelensky is a Western schemer, just a tool of the West, and he's and that's his anti-Semitic portrait of Zelensky as being this, string operator and being controlled by Biden. And this is still alive. I was just in an Uber on the way here, and there was a man who drove me to the airport from Donetsk, and he had the Russian radio on. He said, "Hi, Wendy." I said, "Hi." I said, "Vendichka," and immediately he just went off and started spewing all this stuff. So it's right here in California. Holocaust inversion, which is to basically turn everything on its head, to the really revolting assertion by Lavrov that the Jews caused the Holocaust. And then just this reality of what's going on in Russia. This is not an issue so much of Ukraine's identity crisis. It's really about Russian continuities and not being able to come out from their own history, and the history in Ukraine of imperial continuities of Russification and the anti-Semitism of the Orthodox Church and the Pale of Settlement, the concentration of Jews into this kind of reservation in the 18th century. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that's a Tsarist invention, right? The Tsarist police created that, and that started in Paris and was meant to sow kind of discord and conflict within, Western Europe. This is late 1890s. The history of pogroms, right, of anti-Jewish violence. The history of the suppression of the Holocaust during the Soviet Union. They were all peaceful Soviet citizens. They're not going to be specific about the anti-Semitism. And the history of collaboration in Russian history. It's very important to remember that this great patriotic war, that's how the official Soviet history describes it. When you look at the Soviet historiography, right, it starts in 1941. It's 1941 and 1945. What happened in 1939? What happened to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? That's the biggest act of collaboration that started the Second World War than anything I can imagine. So that gets cut out of the picture, right? And it's also interesting how Putin, during all of this, he's at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for the new museum on Peter the Great and how great Peter the Great was. Peter the Great, who was the Westernizer, right? And this is an anti-Western, anti-NATO campaign. Peter the Great, who built up the Russian Navy. Russia's lost 1/3 of its fleet in the Black Sea, right? So this is what's that situation today. And then the fact that Ukraine is this different country, and its response to this war and unity, the fact that we have a Jewish president at the helm who has legislated against anti-Semitism, has criminalized it, acts of vandalism, you can be imprisoned for them, you can receive stiff fines, you can't run for public office, so that kind of ability to manage that at this time. Freedom House is reporting that's the low point of anti-Semitism in Ukraine right now since the war broke out. 0 physical attacks. I conducted a survey with students in January, and again, similar findings on the ground, interviewing Jewish Ukrainians and non-Jewish Ukrainians. So this is a situation. Ukraine is at its historical low right now as far as anti-Semitism. And some of the attacks that have occurred in those very volatile regions in the eastern southern zone that have been subjected to occupation and so forth. And so we have what Sergei Plokhy over at Harvard would say, the reality of Ukraine as a political nation and not an ethnic nation. So that's my kind of long introduction to this situation we're in today and the weaponization of anti-Semitism specifically in Ukraine. So back to this photo. What are we seeing? And it's, I think, a good exercise in photo research to obviously you're going to want to put everything in its proper context and dig down into the archives and so forth. But there's some interesting ways to think about how one looks at a photograph. And yeah, we have, let me just go through this with you a little bit. I have an extensive footnote. This is from my colleague. The composition of the photograph. Whoops. Sorry, this is not my way of doing this. The composition of the photograph, color, scale, spatial relationships, lighting, contrast, cropping, framing, the aesthetics and objects of the time and various tropes that are part of this particular moment, the polka dot fabric, the shoes, the army coats, the uniforms with the insignias, the central focal point, the punctum, as Bart would say, like where do your eyes go? In this case, I'm drawn to this central part here with the family in the center. Visual allegories about the family, evil, violence, humanity, witnessing, suffering in nature. The materiality of the actual print, the negative. What camera model was he using? The shutter speed. Did he have a zoom lens? Was it possible to have a zoom lens? What was possible at that time as far as technology? What is the angle of the photographer? The viewer's distance from the subject. The closer the viewer is, the shallower the depth of field, preventing the viewer from grasping the events as a whole in its many dimensions. And the afterlife of the image in its provenance, where it ends up in archives, in private, public locations? Is it used in trials? Is it setting things in motion? Is it causing, published in books, displays in meetings, different meanings and contexts over time? So the exercise of the photograph, right? These shoes here. Now, Ravine, the photographer, took this picture. I see this 2024, and I think of shoes and memorials and the absence of presence and the presence of absence. That this was a victim. There are bullet casings down here. There are kinds of pieces of paper on the ground, maybe something having to do with the identity of that victim. It looks like a pair of man's shoes that were kind of peeled off. They're going to recycle those shoes because the collaborators, the booty they got from these massacres were, the objects, the personal possessions of the victims. Environmental history is important. This is broad daylight. That means we have potentially more witnesses. This is the transformation of the landscape in these crime scenes. Was this dug out? The victims are falling into the pit. This whole terrain this is someone's hometown. Their whole terrain is going to change in this forest, in this park, because of the settling of the victims when they're inhumed. They're wearing clothes. It's going to create more space. It's going to compress. There's going to be all kinds of changes to the landscape. There's going to be this kind of moonscape, different vegetation, so you can get into the forensics of these sites. This collaboration image, as I mentioned, they're shoulder to shoulder. He's grimacing. He's firing. This man here is looking with his, he's like a helper. What's he doing there? Assisting in some way. There's a ballistics history here. I had to consult with some people in that field. What kinds of guns are they using? Why is this smoke hovering here? It is the halo effect, which creates also a kind of aesthetic in a horrible way. But this means that there were victims here before. That's the smoke from the other victims, and now when they're shooting again, it's blowing a hole through that smoke, and that's how you get that so-called haloing effect. And of course, here's the full image. And you just, as you study these documents, these visual documents over time, you discover more and more. The first time I saw this, I saw this little boy, barefooted, handheld woman bending over here. But then as we got into it and put it under various filters and zoomed in and out, we made out that there's a child, a smaller one. And that's why she's in this position, because this child is like falling off of her lap. And that was a common practice, to not waste bullets on the children, that they were going to die. They would suffocate in the pit or drowned in the blood of their own kin. So here we have the testimony of Ravine, the photographer. And this is in Slovakian. I don't read Slovakian. This work is in many languages. So I had, in fact, a survivor from Bratislava helped me translate this, which was very interesting as well. So it's multilingual kinds of efforts and pursuits, and you have to draw on a lot of colleagues, actually, to do this kind of work. But what's interesting in his testimony, the photographer, is that he describes his camera here, his Zeiss Icon model. And then you can see what kind of film he was able to put into that camera and how many exposures could he take at that time. Unlike our iPhones, where everything happens on one unit, in the old days, you took the picture and then it had to be developed, and you only had a certain number of exposures. So he had 8. I figured out it was 120 millimeter film that he had in there. He had 8 pictures, and 6 of them we found in the archives. So now we not only had one photograph, but we had a series from midday, October 13th, 1941, 96 women, men and children, most of them children. 49 of them were children. So it's mostly women and children who were killed in this massacre. So then we see the other pictures, and we start to see that he's actually testifying to a series of events. In the book, you'll see there are pictures of the victims being marched to the site. Someone's dead on the road, showing that someone resisted, and for resisting was killed on the path to the actual killing site. And so it's the photographer testifying to that day. The photographer, here's the other one. Now I thought this was an armband, like with a Star of David on it, a kind of marking. And then actually someone contacted me, a forensic kind of photographer specialist in Sweden after the book came out, and she said she looked at it more closely and she believes that's a baby, and that there's blood, that's actually a blood, that that's not a marking on the armband. So there's still details, important ones that are coming out. Here's our guy over here walking, the man with the cap. We have another German official now, and we can see more clearly the uniform, right? And that was another line of research for me. Had been at the museum trying to get a prosecution going on an SS officer who actually signed orders. That was a weird coincidence. He had signed orders for the murder of Jews in these localities, almost 80,000 in Ukraine. This man was in Frankfurt living out his life. And here he was at the command center with Himmler, and this is what was happening on the ground. So these guys were not like Wehrmacht army order police, because I could see from the markings of their uniforms the different buttons, different insignia on the cap, different collar, to try to figure out which German unit was there on that day and go back to the military records. And it turns out that these guys were customs officials. Their charge was to be at the railway station checking packages. They had no business being there. That was an all-volunteer killing squad. None of those people, that was not in their job description, as it were. So here's our photographer, Skrovina, and there's his camera, which he donated to Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava before he died in 2005. And he was very driven at the end of his life to tell the truth of this history, of this collaboration history. So the photographer was the biggest surprise of all in the story, because the picture is taken so closely and not clandestinely. So what's he doing there, right? And if he's taking that picture so close up, from the victim's standpoint, he's a collaborator, he's in uniform. He's humiliating them if they're even paying attention, because he's taking pictures of them at their moment of murder, right? Well, Lubomir Skrovina was a Slovakian guard. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it was an Axis force, primarily German. The Wehrmacht went in, 3.5 million soldiers. It was the biggest land invasion at the time, but what they had with them their allies. They had Croatians, they had Spanish expeditionary forces, other fascist, they had Hungarian troops, they had Slovakians with them, Romanians, right? So this guy's about your age at the time, and he's called up for this duty. He's a hobby photographer. And they say, you can be the scribe for this guard unit. And they stick him in Ukraine, and as he's going across from Western Ukraine towards Kiev, he's witnessing these pogroms and these mass shootings. And he's writing back to his wife, this is horrible. This is not what I thought war was all about, because he's experiencing genocide right behind the lines. He's not experiencing like kind of regular combat operations, as it were. And so he ends up, because he has permission to have his camera, he ends up taking pictures of these up close for the resistance. And so after he takes this picture, and here he is in Mariupol, at the photo studio. There was, as I said, photography is the craze, and actually there were many Jewish photo studios. Marc Chagall was a photographer, Fuhrer was a painter. And so this is in Mariupol, and here he is in the middle, and he's writing back to his wife saying, my hair is turning gray, we're drinking a lot, like I need to get out of this assignment. So he, at the December Christmas break, he feigns illness and refuses to go back into service, because he's supposed to continue on towards Stalingrad. And he and his wife basically together engage in resistance activities. He's in this asylum. He's got the photographs. He's secretly photographing, developing them, and he's giving them to the resistance in Banska Bystrica, which is a center of resistance in Slovakia. And he's telling his Jewish friends and colleagues, including the Jewish gynecologist obstetrician who delivered his son in their attic, don't go. This is what's going to happen to you. And so he's hiding people in his attic, and then he actually is bringing material to the resistance in the forest. So our photographer turns out to be, this was his enough moment, this photograph that you're looking at. So these images can surprise you as far as what's happening and what the photographer's intent is. But this is just to show you this whole camera craze. There were 10% of ordinary Germans by 1939 owned cameras. The Leica, the Zeiss Icon, that had all been patented in the 1920s and 1930s. And the Nazis said, during our moment of triumph, bring your camera. So here's ordinary German soldiers told to bring this camera. The Voigtländer is an optical panzer. I mean, it's so strong it's going to withstand battle. They show it kind of beat up there, but it's going to, and here we have care packages and letters back in the front. So there is this culture of photograph your triumph, but they're not supposed to be taking pictures, though, of here's photographs, a bridge between the home front and the battlefield. So a couple points. Number one, ordinary Germans were taking these pictures, were sharing them with people back home. The SS issued multiple orders, so did the Wehrmacht. Stop taking these pictures, stay away from these mass murder scenes. But they weren't able to suppress that, and that's why this is one of the most photographed genocides and wars we have on record. Mirapol is here. This is a 17th century map. Ettinger, Fabusch, these are different I don't know if these names ring any bells for you. Yeah. And by the way, can everybody hear me? Okay. And let me know if I talk too quickly. I'm always I'm trying to pack it all in. But it's just striking to me that in this 17th century map of settlements in Ukraine, here we have Mirapol in the middle. It's a shtetl we wouldn't really think about. Here's Zhytomyr, Kiev. Now this map may seem familiar to you with all the news going on. Because it was, in fact, a center of Jewish life and Hasidic traditions, and had been part of this during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? Had developed the Arenda system, the manorial system with the Polish lord Hutin-Czapski. Hutin-Czapski was this famous Polish lord, and his fortress is in this town. It's up on the hill with the Sluch River down below. This is the marketplace, and there are stories of Ukrainian peasants coming into the marketplace, and these are the Jews and their shops. They're all in this area here. This was taken in 2014 when I was there. Now we have Mirapol. This is old Soviet champagne bottle. I just took this candidly. This is not staged. And this is the monument to the Great Patriotic War. There's nothing there about the Holocaust, so this is kind of Soviet memorialization. These vacancies here, this is what's missing. This is what's been burned down. This is what's been destroyed from what was a very vibrant kind of a different civilization, right? A completely different historical reality. But this is where the Jews that were marched to that killing site, this is where they were forced to gather the night before and taunted through the night, and the women were sexually violated, and so by the time they got to that site that you saw in the image, they had already endured a kind of night of hell, and they're driven out of their homes and a kind of pogrom in the town. And then here this is where that Soviet monument is here, and then they're forced to march in this direction, come out through here to the path past this building, which was the prison. They were held in this location. You can still see these kinds of bars down here. And we have testimony of Ukrainians singing the death song, dun, dun, taunting them with the guns, and the Germans laughing, a lot of alcohol. In that site, this what is today now a rather bucolic, beautiful place, park. I have this schema, this drawing, because what happened was that photograph ended up in Prague. Lubomir Skrovina is interrogated about it in 1943 and 1958. So first the kind of Slovak Nazis, Gestapo, are after him because he has dangerous photos. Then the Soviet KGB authority is after him after the war. You're a Slovak collaborator. What were you doing in fighting with the Nazis? He manages to survive these interrogations. He's very clever. But that photo, that most incriminating piece of evidence, is then in Prague, right? But as we saw in the picture, this photo also involves German perpetrators, right? and Ukrainian collaborators. So as far as the pursuit of justice, like what happens to them? Well, it's the Soviets in 1985, right? So 40 years after the end of the war, the era of glasnost, the era of Gorbachev, and they're going to pursue justice, give it another go. And there's a Jewish prosecutor in Zhytomyr who says, I'm going to see what happened in Mariupol and see if any of those, former Ukrainian policemen are around. And lo and behold, he finds the people we see in that image. And they're put on trial. And we have their mugshots, and I'll show you in a second. It's the same people, right? So he tracks down those 3 killers, and he makes them reenact what happened. And this is the drawing from the court record. Here's the Mariupol Park, and here's where, remember I showed you that monument with the champagne bottle, and they're forced to march down here like this. This is only like a 10-minute walk, right? And this is the area where that Polish fortress is. And then we have the details of what happened, and as recounted by those Soviet killers. Here's the actual file, the investigative file, and here we have this guy, and you can match him up in his mugshot as one of the guys in that Red Army coat, his fingerprints and everything. Now what happens here is there are 3 killers, Ukrainian killers we see in those photographs, and 2 of them were adults at the time. They were like 19 and 21. But one of those killers was 16 years old. So he was a youth, right? 16-year-old boy, basically, with a rifle, killing these women and children. So he's not executed. There's no statute of limitations on these crimes in the Soviet Union, and the death penalty was reinstated for these kinds of crimes. So the two of these Ukrainians are killed by firing squad in January 1987, and the other one, Rybak, he's sent into the prison system, never to return. My first trip through here was 1992, so it was like I just about missed kind of seeing, maybe potentially going to the trial and all of that. This is what happened on the German side. Not, as far as the pursuit of justice, very perfunctory. Again, they don't have the image, and this is in West Germany, this case. And one of the former members of that German customs unit, they worked in the finance ministry. At his in his retirement, he went into a police station north of Hanover, a small town, Lotzen, in January, and he said, 1969, police station, he says, I want to report a crime that happened in 1941. And it was a mass murder during the Nazi period. The victims were Jewish and Russian people. I don't know who they were. And then he just starts to explain and describe these 2 men who were in the picture, what they were doing and how the Germans got involved. They were in the canteen and they were playing Scott. And an SS man said, how come there's still Jews living in this town? Who's going to take care of them tomorrow? And those 2 gentlemen stood up and said, Jawohl, I'll do that. That sounds like something I want to partake in. They were that type, if you will. They reenacted it afterwards back in the barrack, what they had done. They were proud of what they had done. But that case didn't go anywhere. It was 1-year investigation. They couldn't find one of the killers. The other one lied and lied and lied. But it's revealing, obviously, to have the photograph, read those German testimonies where they said it was all Ukrainians who did the killing, or we weren't there. Just all of this kind of obfuscation and deflection and lying, and realized, that these are very unstable sources. These perpetrator testimonies have to be dealt with very carefully. What about the family? Because as I studied the photograph and thought about that family unit and about, in the history of the Holocaust and memorialization of the Holocaust, we talk about the individual. We get the individual ID card. Or we talk about 6 million. Or we talk about 33,000 in Babi Yar. But what about the family unit as a target of genocide errors and as an experience of the victims? And the way that's kind of incorporated into the history. And in genocide studies, it's root and branch genocide is when you go after the full family because there will be no one to return, to avenge, right? Hitler said to his Croatian ally in July 41, as this is exploding, these mass shootings, the real murder operations are beginning before the gas chambers, he says to him, there shall be no Jewish family left on the continent of Europe, that historically, with expulsions and other pogroms and other episodes, they always come back because these surviving family members, return and then they are back, and new generations have to be dealt with. This is Hitler's thinking, right? And for the victims, the family dynamic in as far as their decisions, when to go, when to leave, suffering with their family members. Everyone's greatest nightmare, right, to be murdered with your family members. That's like these are the really hard, the hard realities of this history, and that family is so much a part of that. So how do I go about finding the identities, uncovering the identities of the family? And I was, presumptuous to the extent that coming out of the memorial world, that with all these databases and ways to search for family histories and survivor registries and Yad Vashem's testimonies, I'll be able to find this family. But no, 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust died in what is the area of Ukraine. Forget about Putin's annexations, but what Ukraine was in 1990, the borders. Half of the victims of the Holocaust that we have not identified are from Ukraine, and they're mostly children. So I started to realize that this particular locality, when they're not registered and brought to the camps, which required a kind of registration, from either, say, at Westerbork, the Dutch were listing all the names of Jews that were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and then when they arrived, the ones who were registered to be laborers were also kind of, you can find them, there's documentation. Not so with the Holocaust by bullets, when the perpetrators go into the communities very quickly, very rapidly, like in a military operation where families have like little time to make any decisions under that assault. And they don't bother to write down names. They just write back to their superiors, this place is free of Jews, this shtetl's gone, it's very kind of general reporting. So in the picture, you may recall that there's the woman, you can't see her face, you can't tell how old she is, but there's that boy, right? And so that means that little boy is standing, he's toddler, so he probably was born, if it's 1941, you think about in your own life, when do you start to walk? And so probably born like maybe 1935, between 35 and 38 maybe. And so then I just started to look at these lists that were drawn up in 1944 of Jews in the community of Mariupol, and their family names here, and then birth dates, and try to find constellations with a son, a boy about that age, from the list of 1,200 Jews, and try to create those family lists, and then work from there, and then go through the testimonies. And so I found I was going A to Z. And I was in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and I got to Vaselyuk, and I read about a family, a mother and 2 children, who were killed in the park in 1941. And not only that, and here it is, but I was Roman, the little boy. This picture was attached to it. And the archivist at Yad Vashem said, like 1% of these testimonies actually have photographs attached to them. So again, back to the photograph. And it just, as I saw this picture and those faces kind of like jumped out at me, I thought, oh, this is, I don't know if I can make the match, but this is how this family wanted to be remembered. This is a family in Mariupol. This is during the occupation. This is late summer 1941. This is after the men have been killed, the head of households have been killed, the first wave. And they went into that same studio where Skrovina was to take this picture. And I struck by this woman here, who was a nurse, and was actually stayed behind to take care of her mother, who would have been here. She's bedridden, and one of the stories in Mariupol that many witnesses, Ukrainians, kept recounting to me was about the old woman who was taken to the killing site in her bed. And that scene of the bed kind of going through and then like thrown in there. So she may have, been there. But these children I thought because these are her children, I thought there must be possible, but not for sure. And I went back and showed this picture to Ukrainian witnesses and who knew these families, who were classmates of these children and so forth. And they recognized this family, said, oh yes, I remember them in the marketplace, and they own the soda shop, and this was this person, or my mom was the maid for this person. But they couldn't say for sure who they were, and they couldn't say for sure that the children and women in the atrocity photo were the same. But we, of course, ended up collecting a lot more stories from these Ukrainian witnesses who, by the way, they're not reading Holocaust literature. They're not up on the latest debate. They don't know all these things that kind of my community kind of delves into. So they just tell what they saw. It's not kind of contextualized in the history or memorial culture, and so it's quite valuable. So after we interviewed these witnesses, we decided to go to the actual crime location, the grave, and I'm here with Yahad and Unam and a French team that I worked with. They're better at the forensic part of this, and this is what we discovered. It matched up specifically, precisely to that Soviet map that I showed you, the schema, and this was the site, and we could immediately see the landscape was completely messed up, like that it was not, and then there were actual bones. I mean, we moved the soil a little bit, and suddenly there were skull fragments and vertebrae, which we didn't touch. I just took this picture. But this is why this landscape, this is from the Soviet investigation of the exhumation that they carried out for the trial. They needed the victims' remains to carry out the trial. And so this is another assault on their souls in this grave site that they brought in this heavy equipment and pulled out all those bones for the trial, and they were reburied near the river. But that's the actual crime scene today. So I just want to exhale for a moment and read quickly and then we'll have time for questions. This wonderful poem, as I was really kind of meditating on the image and on the history, a colleague of mine said, as we looked at it, she said, you need to look at this poem by Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever, who was from Vilna. Sutzkever, what is fantastic, right? He testified at Nuremberg. His poetry, his memoir, there's a new volume out about him, brilliant. And he wrote this poem called A Load of Shoes. And I just want to read a couple of stanzas. And he wrote it when he discovered his deported mother's shoes. His mother had been deported from the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania, probably shot in Ponari, and then all these materials that they kind of went through from the victims. And here he discovers his mother's shoes, who's been murdered. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride? Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. That was written January 1st, 1943. In Sutzkever's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers. Unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today, enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We can't turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of the victims waiting to be killed or other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to the acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Professor Lower would be to answer.
Yeah. These are shoes, the agency of shoes, beyond being photographed and being evocative of the missing. Here we have in Hungary, immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, survivors coming in looking for shoes of relatives who have been deported. So it's like identification of people, recycling of shoes. I just thought that was interesting as well.
While we're waiting, you mentioned that the dress with the polka dots. Was that something you could identify?
Yes, there is, well, a couple of things. First of all, the woman who submitted that testimony at Yad Vashem, Svetlana Budnitskaya, she actually was a child. She was 5 years old during the war. So these were her relatives. She got out when the evacuation occurred in 1941, was kind of behind the lines, and then the family came back and discovered all this, what had happened. And so that's why she got that photograph, because someone kept it, and they said, they were killed, but here, take this photograph. And then she brought it to Michigan, and then she brought it to Jerusalem when she did the testimony. But when I went to visit her in Southfield, she had her own photo albums. And she had photos in there of, including of her mother in Mirapol, reclining on a rock on the Sluch River in a polka dot dress. And her grandfather was a tailor. And so, it made me think about the reality of the Soviet Union at the time, which is, I can't use that as an ID, because in those days there were certain products that would become available en masse. It wasn't a consumer culture, obviously, right? It was the Soviet Union, so everyone had the same hair dye. Everybody had the same material, and then tailors would kind of, tailor it, right? So I started to see a lot of polka dotted dresses from that era in that photo album from the 30s or from the 40s, early 40s. So yeah, and then in the series of photos that Skrovina took, what's rather striking is the last picture. So here's the actual series, and in the picture he takes at the end, he's standing over the mass grave, and he takes a picture shooting into the grave. And if you zoom up on it, you can see polka dot dress, and you can trace the arm of the woman in the polka dot dress, and she's still holding that little boy's hand. So the polka dots, I was able to, we were able to, identify them in that situation at the end. Yeah. So, yes.
As a researcher, excuse me, you've had to expose yourself to really, really horrifying stuff. How has that affected you?
Well, it's 2024, although I started this in 2009, and actually started this in the late 80s when I was in Vienna as a study abroad student learning German. Kurt Waldheim was running for president, and this whole scandal came out. I don't have a direct personal familial relationship to this history. I have a kind of uncle who was in the Canadian Air Force or something. I feel like it's my history because it's human history, and it's what we all should take responsibility for. But I am able to close my laptop, turn to my family, go out, do things, go into nature, So I feel very privileged to do this history. I feel like I'm in a position where I can do it, and it's always just been, for me, just so important. Like I know I just how I am. Like I'm happy to talk about the weather and small talk about the weather and converse and do things like that. And I have a great sense of humor. Some of it's very dark, but it's just I surround myself with friends and loving partner and colleagues, institutional support. I can't even tell you, I've mentioned the museum many, many times, but when you're working with a team of scholars, and you're all, rolling up your sleeves around the table and trying to solve these crimes and identify these victims and get the stories out and try to learn from that for today. Never again is, as you know, it becomes kind of a vacuous, call, plea, and it's like, well, what are you going to do? Like, what can you do at this time and place? And I, chose research and education, and to support, I focused on Ukraine. I went there after the Soviet Union collapsed. I, realized there was a large community that hadn't really been accounted for, and just started to dig around and got so much support in Ukraine. They were super hospitable. The minute I first went to Zhytomyr, that everyone was opening their doors. Oh, please, please, we want to tell you what happened. Bring it back to Washington. Tell everybody what happened. So just the community of support, the importance of it, even seeing things happen today, kind of re-energizes you. And it's just what my calling has been, and that's what I do.
You mentioned earlier how when you first kind of began this specific project, you were really hyper cognizant of the fact that Putin and the Kremlin have been using weaponizing the memory of the Second World War and Stepan Bandera and Ukrainian complicity or small fragments of Ukrainian nationalist complicity with Nazis, with the Nazis. I was going to ask, given the way that the war has progressed and the continued usage of the perversion of this memory by the Kremlin, what precautions did you take specifically, or how did this impact as you were publishing and as you were releasing this book and all of your findings? How did that impact your?
Well, I did observe a shift as far as, there's been this simplification, the Ukrainians were the worst. Many of my survivor friends will say, and the Travniki men, like Demyanjuk and their guards, and, or the Warsaw Ghetto, the Askaris as they called them, they were also part of the destruction. The Ukrainian collaborators were brought into the Warsaw Ghetto to help support the Germans. They're in the Stroop report. So that this, particular group from a non-country, I should add, at the time, was instrumentalized in that way. And, very specific to that time, anti-Soviet, anti-Bolshevik. They had just come through the Holodomor. They were this nation that wanted to become a nation and had failed numerous times in bloody civil wars and in memory, First World War pogroms, and failed attempts at unification and independence. And dependent on the great powers to find that support, including the Germans in the First World War, right? And they became more radicalized in the interwar period, like all the fascist movements did, right? The OUN was established in 29, and then they really took this radical turn in 39, 10 years later. So that history is consistent with European history and other fascist movements. And so you can't kind of single out any particular nation and then make it kind of reify it like that's just their gene pool, right? I'm not going to engage in that. That's exactly what I'm trying to move away from, these kinds of racial categorizations, right? So that was then. That was horrific. If you study the pogroms in Lviv, Lemberg, 1941, we have newsreel footage of it. The proclamation of the OUN at that time, which was anti-Semitic as well as anti-Bolshevik, and the crimes of the Ukrainian nationalists against Poles in 1943 as they tried to make Ukraine for Ukraine, and so this ethnic cleansing business, right? Again, the Romanians had their own program they were going to pursue in the same way. This was considered a legitimate way to form a nation around these models, around genocidal models, right? And the Nazis went, they were the leader. And so, I just realized that I need to be very careful about telling that history from that time so people can understand it, and also understand that countries change, generations change. I would never blame, the descendants of Nazi perpetrators. You don't blame the sins of the father on the son, and so it's not constructive, and it's ahistorical. And the other thing is that, like, as someone like Masha Gessen would say, history is not destiny. So you can't start with what you think is the way things should be historically and insist that they need to be that way, especially when you've got it wrong to begin with the Kiev and Rus business. But so that, so my job as a historian is to not shy away from that, but to come out into the world and say, hold on a minute, I know this is complicated, but work with me. And I don't have all the answers, but at least make that effort because then you have more, as they say, truth decay and post-factual kind of society culture if you don't call that out with your sources and emphasize precision and accuracy and integrity in these ways. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for presenting tonight. I have a question. Early on, you said you were pointing out to us that there's misappropriation of these images and they're used in ways that violate kind of the integrity of victims. I guess I want to ask you whether you feel your work has sidestepped all that, or does your work also exploit the photographs? Because at times I think about your project and I say, how noble and humane to try and find the actual identity of someone who was a victim. That is a beautiful thing to restore that memory, a name. On the other hand, to present, as you did tonight, there's a kind of objectification and extraction of information that feels sterile, scientific, historical. So I feel a tension on the question of whether you are or are not exploiting the victim's photographs, atrocity photographs. Do you feel you are, or is it a question for you
I
too?
definitely grapple with that, and that's why I, talk about it in kind of controlled spaces and try to have these conversations, as it were. It was very, even with the cover of the book, the Hungarian edition, they just sent me the cover this week. And I, think about the situation in Hungary right now. And what did they show? They just showed the killers in that they cropped it like to here. All this is dark, right? Or just bleeding out. So it's like this. And it's so pornographic. I said, you can't have this image of this woman bending down and this gang and then not, you've got it. And I really struggle with that because I'm not trying to exploit this image in that way. It's here. It's what happened. In the argument for not looking and for not using, right? I went to the Shoah Foundation testimonies. There was like 50,000 of them. And I was a fellow there, and I went through the database, and I went through and searched and find photos, right? When do survivors use these photos? Do they use them, right? Are they comfortable with them? And they're using them all the time and they're putting them up in front of the camera. This is what happened to us. Don't forget. Don't, suppress it. Don't put a gloss on it. Please, this is horrible to look at, but imagine we actually experienced this. So I kind of felt like if the survivors that I studied collected these photographs, even of atrocities that had nothing to do with their family members, just because it documented something like similar to what they saw or similar to what they knew happened to their family members. So, when I see survivors saying, look at this, do something about it, and perpetrators, burning their photo albums, it's there. It's there for us to not exploit, but to learn from. And it was already being exploited in the mass media, in textbooks, in presentations. So it's kind of like, okay, this is what we have. Can we address these issues and also talk about how to incorporate them and do the research that needs to be done on them, especially if it's the only trace of an entire community or entire massacre. But yes, I hear what you're saying as far as, you know, having a crossover book, you know, on this topic. So yeah, it has definitely bothered me.
I want to thank you. This was an extraordinary presentation to hear, and as difficult as it is to see that picture, I think it's essential that people see that. When I was 11, I was looking at a Jewish encyclopedia, and I saw a picture in the encyclopedia, and there was a naked man in front of a large ditch with naked women, and he was covering his genitals. And I was 11, I'd never seen a naked man before.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so puzzled by what was going on, and it was so different and disturbing what I saw. And it's something I will never forget, and it has drawn me to continually try to understand this, because it's very difficult to understand. But my question that I'm leading to is, in this picture, there's only one pair of shoes we see, and you mentioned booty. And I know from many of the executions in front of pits, people are naked, and I gather there was more organization. Maybe, I don't know if those occurred in different parts, but obviously people had to plan to pick up the clothes and pick up the shoes. This looks like a 16 and a 19-year-old who were drinking the night before, very haphazardly. I mean, the ditch was obviously well dug, but it looks like there's not a lot of thought here. They're just executing people and throwing them away, basically. Is that true? Were there times when things were far more organized? And
yeah, I mean, it was all kind of organized, and the Germans developed in those first months, and then Himmler himself came out. He wanted to see what was going on, and then they shifted their attention to gassing methods. But they did measure, you know, they would calculate the size of the community and how much volume they would need, how big the pit should be, and measure that out. In this case, they had to stop the shooting and then dig another pit because they had miscalculated. And they bring the, and you can see the development of these methods as far as they realize that they shouldn't be inhuming them with their clothes on. They can recycle their clothes, and that's value for the local community. That's payback, and they auction them off and everything. And they also recycle them for the ethnic German communities, like nothing to go to waste, as it were. And then with the children, they realize that they don't need to waste the bullets. And so by the time they get to Babi Yar, you know, and they have 33,000, then it's a very system. I mean, they've got kind of battalions with all the organization of guarding and marching, and the victims over here, this is over there. But yeah, no, but they're not smooth operations. These are bloody massacres. So even though, you know, they're organized and they're state-sponsored, you know, as you read the testimonies and the details and everything, it's not Keystone Cops. I mean, it's a systematic campaign, and there is a kind of machinery to it. How they use the environment very deliberately, using ravines, so they don't have to dig the holes, and just dynamite them so that they can the soil will fall on top of them. Using swamps. So there's a whole environmental history piece to this that the Germans are thinking through, yeah, and it's tricky, as the gentleman mentioned, because recounting this sounds, you know, it's graphic, and it can sound very scientific and kind of sterile, and the literature in Holocaust historiography went too far in that direction into the early 90s, and Saul Friedlander called that out, I think, really well in his book Nazi Germany and the Jews. He's a survivor himself, prominent historian. And he said, you know, you just keep recounting these German testimonies of what happened, and it's just a repetition. It's like another salvo of the history, and you're not identifying the victims. You're not putting any human faces on this, and you're treating Jews like corpses, you know, and that's definitely was true, and he called for an integrated history, and an ethical kind of response to the way the history is being written, right? Which was really, really important.
So, right now, I see where there's a lot of value in this, but I'm wondering the next maybe 20 to 40 years, there will be no more living perpetrators. There will be no more living witnesses. And how do you project how this will affect your interest, your organization going forward, a couple of decades more from now when there's nothing left to substantiate and investigate, where anyone can be brought to for the crimes?
Yeah, now we don't have any justice, courtroom justice. We have more kind of historical justice. But as we speak, the collections that are coming in to the Holocaust Museum, for instance, they just built a couple years ago the Chappelle Center, this whole installation in Maryland for storage, and they're going to outgrow that. The European countries involved in this are declassifying their trial records and a lot of their perpetrator records. Of course, we got this huge deluge when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, and then you could actually go to these sites and go to these regional archives. But there's just enormous amounts of material that is still being declassified and brought in, and artifacts and photographs. And so there will not be a shortage of material while the witnesses have passed and we can't get into the courtroom. We are going to have this history from all levels. I don't want to even say from the ground up. Definitely the European dimension of it. It's going to be less Berlin-centered, as Vatican Archives just opened, right? What was the Pope up to? What were the what were the priests up to? So I think it's for research is definitely a growth field because of the richness of the material, the documentation, the fact that the victim community. So writing diaries, incredible literature, poetry. I was just reading that poem. And it is this source base that brings us to other cases as well. I mean, in genocide studies, there's now a better interaction and dialogue with my colleagues working on all different cases going back to ancient times. And they're like informing other cases. And, when you have, say, the history of Native Americans, out back where I am in California, and you don't have the ample documentation, and you might only have that one photograph of the Yuki that was wiped out, in Sacramento, or Fremont standing up on a pile. Then it's like, okay, that's all we have, and maybe, in conversation with these Holocaust scholars, I can think about different ways to triangulate that and piece that all together. I mean, Christopher Browning's book on how to analyze perpetrator testimony and tests of these various analytical categories. That applies to a lot, tests of veracity, tests of logic, tests of self-interest. Like you can look at that and interrogate anybody, So it's just some of these studies, when people say, oh, don't we know all there is to know? And it's like, then another piece comes out. I'm hoping my next book is going to maybe shine light on on the implosion, the collapse, and how terror comes apart, and what lessons we can glean from that as far as the end of genocide. We spent a lot of time talking about the killing. We spent a lot of time talking about people's rise to power and how they keep power, but I think it might be helpful to realize that they don't have it forever, and what we might be able to do to expedite that. Yeah.
So, curious to hear more about the relationship between the photographer and the people who are doing this. And I assume that there's some insights from his testimony. How aware are the people that he's there? What do they think is the value of their being taken? Just where it kind of ends up kind of more visible. I mean, this whole phenomenon of photographing evil is quite, one level quite astounding and disturbing. But obviously, they know he's there in some sense. I'm just curious about what you could learn about what was going on.
That's such a great question, and it hasn't really been posed before, because those Germans kind of just came in that next day. They, were these customs officials. So they weren't interacting much with the Slovakians who were in a different barrack. That unit was not stationed there that long. They were kind of passing through. So, the reason why I figured out that they were customs officials was because Skrovina, who was interrogated close to the time in 43 and then 58, provided those little details that were real gems, where he just happened to say in passing, oh, he used the term finance guards. Finance guards. And then I was like, okay, that was, I was going after SS people and regular police and all that.
It's just kind of like they really weren't paying attention.
They were, yeah.
Having the pictures being taken.
Yeah. Yeah, he was the scribe, so he was allowed to he was in charge of the war diary, and his commander said they could hear the screaming and the shooting, and the commander said, his Slovakian commander, it was a small unit, it was like a platoon, it was like 25 people or something, and he said, go check it out. And so he just went over, and the Germans were already carrying this out with the Ukrainians. The Slovakians had not been deployed for this. But he was in uniform, so he could show up, and he was allowed to be there. And they didn't interfere with him taking pictures. In fact, the Germans probably were like, great, take my picture. They're not telling him, go away with the camera. I mean, they're also very focused on what they're doing. But, yeah.
This must be for all the American lynchings.
Yeah, the lynching photographs.
Pictures that they'd be very proudly by the unhanging.
And the postcards, those were put on postcards.
Right.
Yeah.
Postcards were circulated.
Well, this was one of my questions in the book. If you find something like a photograph of a lynching, which they've been in circulation, the one from Marion, Indiana, or whatever, it's, with the woman, right? And has anybody looked, now people, it's not me, but now, like with photography research, with people saying, who are all these people underneath that hanging man? And
would send them around proudly, sort of like,
yeah.
wish you were here or something like that.
There's an exhibit now at the Eastman Kodak Museum, George Eastman Museum. I was just at last week or 2 weeks ago. The exhibit shows all these famous lynching photographs, and they they airbrushed out the victim, so it's lynchings without victims. It's more of an artistic kind of, but also memorial. Yeah. Anyway, just coincidentally, sorry.
Okay, so
Thank you so much. Yes.
thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.